Hello, my name is Sumit Mandal and I am an historian at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia campus. I shall be speaking about making democracy in Asia the case of Malaysia. Let me introduce my lecture. This lecture examines efforts at making democracy in Asia by focusing on the specific case of Malaysia since the 1990s. The lecture addresses the following question: what is democracy in Malaysia in practice? Malaysia's leadership once strongly advocated a rejection of Western democracy in favor of Asian forms of democracy. This politics was advanced through the notion of Asian values and unleashed considerable debate. Whereas the debate about Asian values rests on philosophical, political, and economic arguments, it is also worth considering how Asians have pursued democracy in practice. Let us take a look at some background on Malaysia. First, let us identify the country in a map of Asia. It is marked by a red triangle on this map. Now, let us take a look at the map of the country itself. Malaysia is noteworthy because it has achieved significant social and economic transformation since achieving independence from British rule in 1957. The new economic policy, or NEP, of 1971, for instance, served to improve the social mobility of a generation of people who were largely based in rural areas by providing increased access to education and scholarships. Malaysia has also had high levels of economic growth that translated into improved infrastructure from the 1980s until the 1990s. The Asian financial crisis of 1997 brought this growth to a halt, as it did in Thailand, Indonesia, and Singapore, though with different levels of impact. According to many scholars, the challenge to democratization in Malaysia lies in the country's heavily ethnicized politics. Mavis Puthucheary and Noraini Osman believe that the ethnicized political system of Malaysia is not the natural result of the country's oft-noted cultural diversity. Rather, the ethnicized political system emerges from political choices made since independence. Donna Amoroso, for instance, shows how the aristocratic early leaders of the United Malays National Organization, also abbreviated as UMNO, encouraged a cultural rather than a political basis of nationalism as a means of deflating, threatening class-based politics. As Amoroso puts it, dampening political debate in favor of unity and cultural activities had the effect of elevating Malayness to a supra-political position. Put another way, nation trumped politics. Nativistic and seemingly non-ideological, any activity which was strictly about culture or improvement of the race was compared favorably to a contentious politics which drew on foreign ideologies like democracy or communism. Now, more than a few scholars have regarded Malaysia as an authoritarian state, differing only in the degree to which it might be so. Benedict Anderson puts it rather starkly as follows. Peninsular Malaya itself had only been granted its independence in 1957, after the colonial state had smashed the powerful local communist movement. Malaysia inherited and later improved on the colonial regime's draconian anti-subversion laws and steely bureaucracy, but not the insurrection itself. The country had a permanent authoritarian government throughout its existence. The Malaysian state, however, sees itself as a democracy based on the existence of a parliamentary system to which representatives of the people are elected through regular elections. Mahathir Mohamad, the Malaysian leader famous for extolling Asian values, was not against democracy. Instead, he called for an Asian type of democracy. He frankly stated his belief that this kind of democracy rested on strong centralized political control over the country, alongside the suppression of dissent and freedom of expression where necessary. Now that we have some background on Malaysia, let us turn to the Asian financial crisis of 1997, as this crisis was a key moment in making democracy in the country. Major political crises were precipitated by the financial crisis in Indonesia and Malaysia in 1998. Movements working towards the democratization of Indonesia coalesced and gained momentum as the power and international standing of President Suharto faltered. The democratization movement that emerged came to be named Reformasi, to mean reform. It became one of a constellation of forces that eventually forced President Suharto to step down in May 1998. Indonesian developments affected politics in Malaysia. A rift began to emerge between the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Mahathir Mohamad, and his deputy Anwar Ibrahim. Among other things, they differed on the approaches to be taken for the country's economic recovery. Mahathir sacked Anwar from his post in early September 1998. In a matter of weeks, demonstrations emerged against Mahathir and the government in the country's capital, Kuala Lumpur. These were the first major demonstrations to take place since 1974, when students protested the impoverishment of the rural poor as a result of falling rubber prices. Here's an image of farmers and students gathered in Baling Kedah in Malaysia in 1974 to demonstrate against rural poverty. At this juncture, it is helpful to consider the debate on Asian values in a little more depth. Asian values was much touted in the 1990s as the basis of political stability and economic growth before the advent of Reformasi. Notably, at the height of economic growth, Mahathir, like Lee Kuan Yew, his counterpart in Singapore, frequently extolled the virtues of Asian values. Economic well-being and growth was prioritized, over democratic space and human rights. Democracy, at least as understood in Europe and North America, was said to be incompatible with Asia. This defense of Asian ways to political and economic development petered away following the financial crisis. Mahathir and Lee regarded Asian values as the basis of the high-growth economies and political stability of their respective governments. However, Asian values might also be seen as the ideological outcome of the authoritarian politics, economic development, and family-centeredness that undergirded their respective governments. In this sense, Asian values could be said to have represented and justified the political and economic course taken by Malaysia and Singapore. The major economic troubles and the serious political crisis Malaysia and Indonesia underwent raised questions about the validity and wisdom of Asian values. Importantly, the rise of mass demonstrations in Malaysia proved once again to new generations that Asians were capable of challenging authoritarian rule. The respected economist Amartya Sen produced an important critique of Asian values in 1999, to which we turn next. Amartya Sen has argued that democracy is compatible with Asian societies, in contrast with the views of Mahathir and Lee. Sen also believes that elements of what might be considered democratic thinking and practice are found in classical Asian texts. To quote from him, "There is also another argument in defense of an allegedly fundamental regional contrast, one related not to economic circumstances, but to cultural differences. Perhaps the most famous of these claims relates to what have been called Asian values. It has been claimed that Asians traditionally value discipline, not political freedom, and thus the attitude to democracy must inevitably be much more skeptical in these countries." Let us turn to a little bit more from Amartya Sen. It is very hard to find any real basis for this intellectual claim in the history of Asian cultures, especially if we look at the classical traditions of India, the Middle East, Iran, and other parts of Asia. For example, one of the earliest and most emphatic statements advocating the tolerance of pluralism and the duty of the state to protect minorities can be found in the inscriptions of the Indian Emperor Asoka in the 3rd century before the Common Era. With a better idea of the debates on Asian values, let us consider Reformasi in 1998 more closely. On September 20th, 1998, large crowds began to gather around the National Mosque located in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and the notion of Asian values began to seem like an illusion. People were upset by the sacking of Anwar Ibrahim and showed their anger by marching peacefully from the mosque to a place called Dataran Merdeka, which in English means Independence Square, whose central location and one-time British colonial cricket grounds made a large gathering feasible. Here's an image of demonstrators gathered at the National Mosque in Kuala Lumpur in 1998 in unprecedented numbers and listening to Anwar Ibrahim speak. He's the gentleman with the mic, and his wife Wan Aziza Ismail beside him. The estimates of the crowds gathered varied from 40,000 to 80,000. Whatever the numbers, Malaysia had never seen a demonstration on such a scale. There was a 25-year period during which protests were relatively small in size, following the student demonstrations of 1974. The government imposed strict controls on student political activity in universities in response to those protests. The Indonesian term reformasi was borrowed and applied to the demonstrations and the movement that emerged in Malaysia. Reformasi in Malaysia was not as far-reaching as Indonesia, in that it did not bring about a change in leadership. However, the limits of making democracy were challenged as a new generation of Malaysians familiarized themselves with the practice and language of protests and street marches. While some feared the consequences of the demonstrations, others became increasingly secure in challenging the state in this way. Next, we consider if reformasi changed the nature of politics. What can we say of demonstrations since reformasi? Since reformasi, ways of demonstrating have been learned that are inclusive of others, given the culturally diverse character of Malaysians. When the reformasi demonstrations began at the National Mosque in 1998, the space and language used was almost overwhelmingly Islamic. At the same time, there was no overt exclusion of the small number of people of other faiths represented there. However, the shouts in Arabic in praise of God rang out alongside the political slogans. In the years that followed, major demonstrations became explicitly inclusive. There has been strong evidence of trans-ethnic solidarities in the many accounts of the experience of demonstrators that were published in various internet news portals. This was the case during the Bersih demonstrations of 2012, for instance. Bersih, or Clean in Malay, is the name of a coalition of non-governmental organizations dedicated to making sure that elections in Malaysia are clean and fair. Here's an image of demonstrators gathered to push for clean and fair elections in Kuala Lumpur in 2012. To say that demonstrations have in general moved towards trans-ethnic goals, however, would be misleading. Demonstrations have become as complex as political contestation in public life since 1998. Not only groups standing for trans-ethnic solidarities, but others espousing ethnocentric causes have demonstrated. Next, we ask ourselves about the state of electoral politics since reformasi. The 2008 general elections brought to Parliament an unprecedented number of members of opposition parties who included among them not only veteran politicians, but new ones whose backgrounds were in social and political activism. The 2013 general elections more or less maintained the gains made by the opposition. In each elections, however, candidates standing for Barisan Nasional or National Front, the ruling coalition of political parties, were severely challenged. Key leaders of the regime lost their seats or had their majorities greatly reduced. Electoral democracy appeared to have triumphed in each instance, and Malaysia had been proven to be a healthy democracy for many. An independent tribunal, however, declared in 2013 that there were numerous problems and unfair practices in the way in which the elections were carried out. Furthermore, the non-governmental coalition Bersih believes that the root causes of unfairness in elections lie in gerrymandering and tampered electoral rolls. If reformasi in 1998 was seen as a catalyst for democratization in Malaysia, then its impact on the political establishment was felt only 10 years later in the 2008 general elections. Still, although these elections weakened the ruling coalition's power, the opposition did not take over the government. The journey of making democracy, it would appear, has been long and challenging in the case of Malaysia. Its outcome has not always been clear or decisive. However, new generations learn about making democracy within the possibilities and constraints of the Malaysian context and thereby shape an Asian modernity. Now let me conclude my lecture as follows. It is possible to regard Asian values as part of ongoing efforts by Asians, in this case political leaders, to shape an Asian modernity. If so, then the acculturation to demonstrations by Malaysians might represent an alternative vision of such a modernity. The trajectory of the Malaysian story of democratization, however, is not linear and moving towards a trans-ethnic ideal. Since 2009, ethnocentric groups have broken previously established limits to the language and scale of racialized talk and actions. Alongside trans-ethnic solidarities, then, are a public racist politics of an unprecedented nature. Alongside a breakdown in governance due to weak political leadership is a parliament that has been strengthened by the infusion of new members with a strong commitment to their constituency. The story of making democracy in Malaysia is unfolding in interesting, complex, positive, threatening, and not altogether predictable ways. Lastly, here are the references that I cited in my lecture. Thank you for your attention.